Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I am going to be ranking the novels of Kate Atkinson. The reason I haven't mentioned the short story collections within this ranking is simply because I haven't been the biggest fan of Kate Atkinson's short fiction, and I am still not over one story that I read recently in which it was an incredibly linear storyline in which nothing magical was happening at all, and then there was a talking horse. I don't mind a bit of wry humour and the idea that the world is not as we know it, but usually I need that to be something within the entire story. So the short story collections don't sit well with me, although I do like that there are aspects of collections that come into play in all of them and characters that connect with one another as they do in her novels. So last year I read the entirety of Kate Atkinson's works, bar one, which we will get to in this video. Early last year, we had a copy of Emotionally Weird donated to the charity shop, and I remembered that my friend Joy had lent me a copy of that book years before because she said that one of the characters reminded her of me. I could not remember which character this was, and I was also writing the charity shop book at the time, and I remembered Emotionally Weird being a bit experimental in terms of the metafictional aspect within its form. I decided to reread that, and once I finished it, I began rereading it again, and I realised I was just in the mood for Kate Atkinson's prose. From there, I mentioned this to Joy, who lent me another book. I had Life After Life on my shelves, so I had that, and I had other books by her that I'd been accumulating, but I hadn't been reading. And so throughout the year, if a Kate Atkinson came into the shop, I was acquiring it and reading it. Or if I saw it at the library, I would pick it up and read it. What I found with Kate Atkinson is that a lot of the time she is writing big tales with a huge cast of characters that in the beginning might not know each other, but towards the end there will be something Dickensian where you realise how these characters all interweave and interplay with one another. There is also a big focus on family, usually, within her tales. That is an aspect that I've liked. Something else I've liked is the way that she shows the various decades of the 20th century, and so there is a sense of nostalgia there. There is also a wry humour within her prose that I've come to appreciate, and there is something about her prose that I keep coming back to, because when I read a Kate Atkinson story, it just feels that I can put my trust in that writer. I will happily sink into whatever she wants to tell me. That being said, there are Kate Atkinson novels that I like more than I like others, and I'm going to get into that here. I believe there are 12 Kate Atkinson novels, and I'm hoping there are because I have 12 written down here. And coming in at number 12, we have Case Histories. I do have a copy of this, I just could not find it. This is the first book in the Jackson Brodie series. I had previously read another of the Jackson Brodie titles when I was at uni. What had happened when it came to Case Histories, and the reason it's so low, is simply because I had read so much Kate Atkinson at this point that I began to realise that she would often write similar stories. And indeed, within this novel, there were certain scenes that I'd already seen her write before, and it felt not derivative, but it did feel like I've already seen the author do this before. And so there were scenes within Case Histories that seemed reminiscent of scenes within Life After Life, and I don't know whether the author did that intentionally, but just felt like we were going over old ground. So in Case Histories, we actually have Jackson Brodie investigating a missing girl, and then there is a rather overweight man whose daughter was murdered at the company in which he worked. I think it was a decade earlier, if not longer. Throughout the novel, and the one constant being Jackson Brodie, all of these characters really end up coming together. This is at the bottom, as I say, simply because it's the one that caused me to take a bit of a break from reading the author, because it did feel like it was getting a bit samey. Even though it's in the 12th place here, I do want to reiterate that Kate Atkinson might have become a favourite author of mine over the last year. So even though I'm putting it in the bottom place, that does not mean that it's a bad book. It just means that it's not my favourite of Kate Atkinson's work. I very much enjoyed everything that I read by the author last year, bar the short story collections. Next, we have Human Croquet. And I toyed with not putting this in this position because within this novel, we're getting told the family history of the Fairfaxes through one character. There is this aspect within the novel where the character will be walking along the road and find herself slip through time, and she goes back in time and looks at her familial history. Towards the end, something happened where these time loops seemed to be happening more often, and she found herself able to change the way things happened, sort of like we saw in Life After Life. And I do wonder whether this was a precursor for Life After Life. The only thing that I didn't like about the book is the way everything was explained at the end. It felt like a bit of a kick in the teeth, and I did wonder whether the author had been forced to put that in, because I just felt like the author didn't want to sink into the fantasy. It just frustrated me because it had been such an interesting plot point, and it was the way that the author just chose to throw that out the window and say, oh, well, none of that actually happened. That is one of my main bugbears with the next book that I have coming in at number 10, which is A God in Ruins. Because in this book, the author does something similar. In A God in Ruins, we are following the character of Teddy, who was popular in Life After Life. Unlike Life After Life, this is spanning his entire life, and we don't have the case of him dying and something resetting and getting to see that scene over again. We get to see the way that Teddy's life went after the events of that first book. My issue, again, is with something that happens within the last 20 pages. I am aware that this story is a fiction, and perhaps the author was commenting on that the reader really needs to understand that fiction isn't real, and these events didn't happen regardless of how we feel about the characters within its pages. However, once again, it felt like a kick in the teeth. I was not in the way that I wanted to end my experience with reading Kate Atkinson. I did not care for the way this book ended. I did find it a bit of a slog to actually get through, but in terms of writing, I do think it was above Human Croquet and Case Histories in terms of the way that I felt about the characters, the way that the author talked about how we treat the elderly and treat elderly family members really spoke to me, especially when we consider everything they've been through, the way in which Teddy ends up getting treated by his younger relatives towards the end of his life. It felt real, and it was also somewhat upsetting to read. I appreciate Atkinson for including all of those aspects within this tale. It's just the ending rubbed me the wrong way. And then we have Big Sky, the latest Jackson Brodie book. What I liked about this book was that it was set in Whitby, and I'm sure it was Whitby. So it doesn't say that it's Whitby. It says that it's a quiet seaside village in North Yorkshire. So I've decided it's Whitby, but it could be somewhere else entirely. I don't know. That has been one of the aspects about Kate Atkinson's books that I've liked, is how much she will set stuff in Yorkshire as well. And Yorkshire has been one of my favourite places to visit for a while. For me, the only reason that this is in this place, it discusses some very heavy themes. I did not find the humour that the author seems to think is within this book. But something that I do like about the Jackson Brodie series is the cast of characters, and how characters from earlier books in the series will turn up in the later books. And I think that that's something that I prefer more than the mystery aspect of it, because more often than not, Jackson Brodie isn't really there to solve the mystery. The reader will know how something's gone from the off. It feels more like he's trapped within this sequence of unfortunate events. Here, Kate Atkinson is discussing a dark theme in terms of human trafficking. Like I say, I didn't see the humour in it, but I do think it spoke a lot about the treatment of women as well. And then we have Transcription. This is the one that I did not read last year. Indeed, I had forgotten it existed. I did buy myself a new copy of this because I originally had it in hardcover years ago, and it was a book that I liked. It's here in this position simply because it is a book that I liked. I do wonder how I would feel about it if I did go back and read it now. I don't think that it discussed the familial aspect as much as Atkinson's other books did. And from what I remember, it really was perhaps the most linear storyline of hers. I listened to either a Desert Island Disc or an interview with the author about this book. It gave me a bit of a newfound respect and a want to read this one. Then we have Started Early, Took My Dog. I did consider putting this higher in the list, This is the fourth Jackson Brodie book. We have the character of Tracy Waterhouse as played by Victoria Wood in the adaptation. I originally wondered what this book was going to be about, and having read this one, you can see how themes within this might have inspired Big Sky. And I did read that originally Atkinson planned to have the protagonist of Big Sky be Tracy Waterhouse, with the idea of Victoria Wood coming and playing Tracy again on screen, but unfortunately Victoria Wood died. I don't know how true that is, but there was a line in this that cemented it as humorous to me, which was when Tracy has gone out on a date with a man who owns a spiritual bookshop, and the line was, she'd hoped for enlightenment, but all she got was glandular fever. And that was just my sort of humour, where we were talking about the characters' lives outside of the ongoing crimes within the pages. That's what I like about the Jackson Brodie books. I like this regular cast of characters. I'm not necessarily there for the tales of the crime within these. I like to see how they're dealing with the situations that they're put in. I like how their lives are complicated and how they weave in with each other. I like how insular the characters become, and the interior, not monologue we get because it's all in the third person, but we get to hear a lot of what they're thinking and how they interact with the world. And that is something that I have really enjoyed with these books. Next we have Shrines of Gaiety, and this is the most recent novel. I really don't know how I feel about this book. For me, it felt like for 250 pages, all of these people were off doing their own thing. And I began to wonder whether this was the new way in which Atkinson writes, and I just wasn't used to it at the point in which I read this book. And I wonder if, similar to Transcription, if I returned to this book having read everything that Kate Atkinson has now written, would I have a different opinion or a new respect for it? Because it feels very chaotic for the first 250 pages as we dart in and out of these different people's lives, and then everything starts to come together, coalesce, and we get to see how all these characters will interact with one another, and things begin to make more sense. This is almost a return to form for Atkinson in that we do have a big family narrative, and unlike other books by the author, we begin with Nellie Coker, and the reason I say that is because in Atkinson, the mother is usually the figurehead and someone mysterious, and here she's at the forefront of the narrative. I like that because usually we're seeing everything from the daughter's perspective, unless it's behind the scenes at the museum, in which we do go back into the past to look at the mother's life and how she became this character, but it also felt a bit like it was Ruby's story. Whereas in Shrines of Gaiety, although we go into all these different people's lives, it very much felt like Nellie was the core of it. She was the main character in which all these others orbited, and I did like that we had this older woman being the focus of the narrative, especially somebody who is said to have this empire that she's created. And it's just great to see her machinations and how she's not really the standard Atkinson heroine. And next I have When Will There Be Good News? This was the one that I had to read for university, and when I read it last year, I was shocked by how much of it I had forgotten. In the beginning, we see an entire family, bar one, killed in a quiet countryside lane. We skip ahead, is it 30 years? Yeah, 30 years we skip ahead. We're now in Edinburgh. There is this character of Reggie who is working for this rather rich woman. She is living on her own after her mother's death. She has a bit of a brother who has told people that he's called Reggie. He's committed a few crimes and getting in with the wrong sort. And then we have this event. And this event happened, and I thought, how did I forget this? This event involves Jackson Brodie. It sees the character lose something of his identity. That is something that I've seen within a few of the Jackson Brodie books, actually, is mistaken identity or lost identity and re-examining who somebody is when the world seems to have forgotten them. So this was just a thrilling thriller, really. It feels like a turning point in the Jackson Brodie series because we see a lot more returning characters and characters who are going to return and become important to the series, even though we're about to be on the 6th book, I think, later this year. It really is just this kind of literary thriller that I particularly enjoyed. Then we have the second Jackson Brodie book, which I had to borrow from the library, and that is One Good Turn. Several people see this event at an Edinburgh festival in which there is a car crash and a man gets out of a vehicle and attacks one of the drivers. Somebody else gets involved, and we see Jackson Brodie then get embroiled in this crime. It does what Kate Atkinson started doing well, what I talked about at the beginning of this video, where you have this huge cast of characters who seemingly don't know each other, all brought together for one event, and then you get to see the interplaying of their lives before, as it says on a lot of her books, it gets a little bit Dickensian and everything comes together at the end. This was just a brilliant read. Similar to what I said about When Will There Be Good News, it's a literary thriller. Again, we are very introverted and insular with the characters, and when we follow them, it's all their thoughts. And it can feel not a bit claustrophobic, but it can also feel very focused, and I liked that here. At one point, that all the Jackson Brodie books were just going to be at the bottom of the list below the other novels. But when I started thinking about it, I was thinking, just because they are part of a series doesn't mean that the themes they're exploring are any less than real literature. So that's why One Good Turn is here, because great cast of characters, great story, and thrilling, really. However, despite what I just said, the top three are standalone novels. Maybe not this one, but this is Life After Life. Part of me wondered whether to place this book so highly, because it had taken me a very long time to actually finish. I first tried to read this book around the time that it came out, because, again, my friend Joy read it, she adored this book, she started going back and reading certain passages of it, and she really liked the way that Kate Atkinson created this tale. I tried to read it, couldn't get far through it. I tried it again years later, and I think the most I ever got through this book was 250 pages. However, last year, I was just in the mood for Atkinson's prose. This time around, I really liked this tale. At one point, this was at the top of the list. The top three stayed the same, but I'd moved their positions around tons, and I just can't figure out which I think deserves to be in the top spot. But this one's here simply because of the number of times that I tried to get into it first, whereas the other two I just got into immediately and enjoyed them. This is the story of Ursula, who every few pages dies, and then we reset and we go back and we follow the character again and we look at if she'd made this decision, what would have happened. And so we get to really see Ursula live all these different lives. In the end, it was done incredibly well, and setting it during the Second World War, for the most part, allowed, and having this literary device of Ursula dying and coming back, really allowed us to look at the different lives people led during the Second World War, the many ways in which their lives could have gone due to one seemingly insignificant factor. At times, this could be Kate Atkinson's most accomplished work because it has that familial thread that I've mentioned a lot during this video. Also, the writing feels like she's at her best. But saying that, I do like it when Atkinson gets a bit messier with her work. Until this morning, this book was in the number one position. Life After Life was in the second position, and my first book was in the third position. But they all changed today, and they could all change again next week. But currently in second place, we have Behind the Scenes at the Museum. I adored this book when I read it last year. It was one of the final books that I read. I think it was the penultimate one of Kate Atkinson's novels that I read. And my story with this one was that a school friend way back in 2008 said that this was her favourite book. It came into the charity shop, I borrowed it, and it went in a box under my bed for years, never getting read. I've never had any want to pick it up over the years. The number of times it's come into the charity shop, I've always thought it'll be a book that I read one day. I knew the first paragraph because I've tried to read it a few times. Just that first paragraph, never got any further. And then last year, because I was in the mood for Kate Atkinson, I pushed everything else aside because none of the books were impressing me and I knew this author would. I read this one, which follows the character of Ruby Lennox, spans her life and her family's life and discusses various scandals and things going on. I thoroughly adored it. Indeed, it was on my top 10 books list of last year. The only thing that let it down and moved into the second place today is, again, something that happened towards the end, which seemed to come out of nowhere, but also worked to explain something else that went on within the tale. I think that what Atkinson does well within Behind the Scenes at the Museum, and it says it all over the place, is the humour. There is a lot of dark stuff going on within this book, but Atkinson writes with such heart and with such humour, and it almost felt like a very northern voice, a northern way of going about things. But maybe it's just a way that people go about things in general, is finding the humour in the bad and finding those moments of light within the dark. Maybe this book deserved that top spot, but then part of me felt like if I gave it the top spot, then I was almost saying nothing had ever hit the levels of Kate Atkinson's first work. But today it's in second because I really did feel like the book that most suited to my sensibilities is the book that I put in number one position, which is Emotionally Weird. This is the first Kate Atkinson that I ever read. It's the first one that I reread last year. It's the one that started all of this. The reason I say it's the one that speaks to me the most is because it's the one where Atkinson uses various forms to tell the tale. It felt chaotic, it felt messy, it felt humorous, it poked fun at literature. It felt very literary. It felt like it mocked literature but also had a great appreciation for literature. We had Effie and her mother Nora, and one of the things that I liked were the conversations between Effie and Nora, and when Effie was telling her mother about her life, there were certain bits where Nora said that's too many characters, and so we'd go back to that story and suddenly characters were cut out, or what I'm about to say kind of negates what I said about that short story at the beginning, where Effie would, at one point, pulls out a piece of paper, sets fire to it, and the world resets a little bit, and she just says to whoever's there, well, that's postmodernism. And it almost feels like there is a level of unreality to this comedy, and it's completely absurd, and as it says, weird. And I really liked it. I liked the discussion of the parent-child relationship. I liked how it reminded me of my student days. I liked the fact that I have some more history with this book in terms of I was lent this book because somebody was reminded of me within its pages, and it just seems like the most me book. Although I have basically thoroughly enjoyed everything I've read by the author, this one will always have that special place because it was the first, and it has inspired my writing of a specific book in a great many ways. It also set me off on this journey, so it had to be in first place today, regardless of whether I thought anything else was written better or she was more accomplished with another book, because I appreciated the messiness and the absurdity of Emotionally Weird. And them's the books. If you've read all of Kate Atkinson's works, and perhaps had different opinions in the rankings, then please feel free to let me know. If you've read any of these books and simply want to discuss them, then you can do that too. I hope that you have enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed reading Kate Atkinson last year, because until next time, that is all.